It's hard to explain what it feels like to have your world shattered in an instant. The trust that you'd built for years, the love you thought would never fade, gone in a single moment. And for me, that moment came when I walked through that door and saw Chris. He was back from his trip, but something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it right away. It was a quiet night, just like any other, but the air between us was thick with unspoken tension. "Hey, you're back?" I said, trying to sound casual, but my voice cracked, betraying my nerves. Chris barely looked up from his phone. "Yeah," he muttered, his tone flat, distant. "It was fine." Fine? That's all he had to say? I could feel my heart rate pick up as I watched him, sitting there so detached. He wasn't the man I had married. The Chris I knew would have greeted me with a smile, would have asked about my day, would have made me feel like he missed me. But instead, there was nothing. I knew something was wrong. "Did you have fun?" I asked, trying to keep the conversation going, though I knew it was a dumb question. He finally looked at me, his eyes a bit too cold for comfort. "Yeah, I did. Spent time with Sam." Sam, my best friend. The woman who had been by my side for years. The one I had trusted more than anyone. A pit formed in my stomach. "Sam?" I repeated, the words tasting bitter. "You and Sam. You spent time together?" He gave me a shrug, barely meeting my gaze. "Yeah, we just hung out. What's the big deal?" I felt my blood run cold. The unease that had been creeping over me all evening intensified. There was something more to it, something he wasn't telling me. I tried to push the feeling down, tried to tell myself I was overthinking it. But the next few days only confirmed my suspicions. Chris was distant, cold, and avoided any meaningful conversation. I found myself asking questions that I had never thought I'd need to ask. "Chris, is there something you're not telling me? About you and Sam?" He would just look at me, then look away, and tell me that I was being paranoid. "Nothing happened," he'd say, his words almost robotic, his eyes avoiding mine. But I could feel the truth hiding in the spaces between his words. That's when it all started to fall apart. The truth came out, slowly, painfully, and when it did, I realized just how deep the betrayal went. Chris hadn't just been with Sam as friends. They had been more. It was the kind of thing that leaves you breathless, that knocks the wind out of you. To find out that your best friend, the person you trusted with everything, had not only betrayed you but had done so with your own husband. It felt like a cruel joke. I didn't know what to do. I was devastated, broken. Every time I looked at Chris, all I could see was the image of him with Sam. And though I wanted to scream, to throw him out, to demand answers, I didn't. Instead, I swallowed my anger, swallowed my pain, and tried to pretend everything was okay. Because I loved him. I had always loved him. "Chris, I can't do this," I finally said one night, my voice trembling as I sat across from him. "I can't keep pretending that nothing happened." He looked at me, his eyes filled with regret. "I'm sorry, Liv. I never meant for this to happen. I don't even know how it happened." "I don't care how it happened," I snapped, my voice sharper than I intended. "You did it. You betrayed me. And you don't get to act like it's nothing." But despite the anger, despite the hurt, I found myself still holding on to him. I didn't want to let go. The love I had for him was too strong, too deep. Maybe it was foolish, but I chose to forgive him. I chose to believe that we could rebuild what we had, that we could move forward. But I couldn't forget. I couldn't pretend that everything was the same. The damage had been done, and it had changed me. There were nights when I would wake up, my heart pounding, staring at the ceiling, replaying everything in my mind. The way he had acted, the way he had lied. I tried to suppress the thoughts, tried to bury the pain, but it was always there, lurking in the background. Then there was Thomas Johnson, Chris's best friend from university. He had always been around, part of our lives in some way, but he had always kept his distance, never crossing any lines. At least, that's what I thought. In those first few weeks after the betrayal, when Chris was off on business trips or lost in his own guilt, I found myself turning to Thomas. He was a good listener, someone who seemed to genuinely care about how I was feeling. We talked for hours, and in those moments, I started to feel like I wasn't so alone. But it wasn't just his support that started to affect me. It was something else, something I didn't want to admit to myself. Thomas had always been there for me, in the background. But now, with the distance growing between me and Chris, I started to see him in a different light. He was kind to me in a way that Chris wasn't anymore. He listened when I needed to talk, something Chris had stopped doing. There was something comforting about being around him. And as the months passed, as my resentment toward Chris grew, I began to wonder if maybe I could get back at him. Maybe Thomas was the answer. I didn't want to admit it, not to myself and certainly not to anyone else. But Mary Grace, my best friend, saw it. She always had a way of pushing me toward things I wasn't ready to face. Mary had always been one to say, a woman should stand up for herself, and she hated seeing me suffer. It wasn't long before she started planting seeds in my mind, pushing me toward revenge. Olivia, she would say, her voice low and conspiratorial, don't you think you should make him feel the same way he made you feel? At first, I dismissed it, but as time went on, as I grew angrier and more frustrated with the constant emotional distance between me and Chris, the idea started to grow in my mind. Maybe Mary was right. Maybe I deserved to make him suffer. And maybe Thomas, maybe he could be the one to help me do that. It wasn't long before I began to entertain the idea more seriously. Every time I saw Thomas, the thoughts grew more tempting. It wasn't just about getting back at Chris anymore. It was about feeling something, anything, other than the numbness that had settled in my heart. I knew what I was doing was wrong. I knew that it would only make things worse. But at that point, the pain was so deep, and the bitterness inside me so strong, that I didn't care. I was going to make Chris pay. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. I never meant for things to go this far, but the temptation was there, just out of reach, and I couldn't stop myself from reaching for it. It was as if my entire existence had been defined by the pain and betrayal Chris had caused me, and now, I was determined to make him feel the same. But somewhere along the way, I lost track of what I was really doing. What had started as a way to get back at him quickly turned into something more dangerous, a web I had woven for myself that I couldn't escape. It started innocently enough. I invited Thomas to dinner, trying to keep things casual, to pretend I was just a woman enjoying the company of a friend. But the moment he sat across from me at that small bistro, my heart started to race. There was something about him, something comforting in the way he looked at me. It was almost as if he understood the hurt I'd been carrying for years. As we talked, he listened attentively, nodding, his eyes soft and warm. For the first time in months, I didn't feel like I was carrying the weight of the world on my shoulders. You look good, Liv, Thomas said, his voice quiet but genuine. I've missed spending time with you like this. I didn't know how to respond. It had been so long since anyone had made me feel desirable. Chris had stopped doing that a long time ago. But Thomas made me feel like I was the only woman in the room. And that feeling, being wanted, being seen, was intoxicating. The evening passed in a blur. We shared a bottle of wine, laughed over stupid jokes, and talked about everything and nothing. And in that moment, I felt something stir inside me, something I hadn't felt in years. It was an attraction, a pull, but it wasn't just physical. It was emotional, too. I had forgotten what it felt like to be treated with tenderness and care. Chris had always been so distant, so lost in his own guilt and shame. But with Thomas, I felt valued, important. As the night wore on, I couldn't deny it any longer. I wanted more. I wanted to feel this way again, to feel desired and cherished. My resolve, my plan to use him to hurt Chris, began to weaken. Instead of pulling back, I leaned in. You know, I said, my voice low, teasing, you're not so bad for a guy who's always been the good friend. Thomas chuckled, his smile softening. I'm just a guy who cares about you, Liv. You've been through a lot. I looked at him, my gaze lingering a moment too long. There was a silence between us, heavy and charged. I could see it in his eyes. He wanted this too. And in that moment, I realized I wasn't the only one playing a game. Thomas had his own feelings, his own desires. I didn't pull away. Instead, I leaned in closer, my heart racing. I wasn't thinking anymore. I was just feeling. The rest of the night was a blur, and when I woke up the next morning, I had no idea how I had gotten home. The only thing I could focus on was the heat of Thomas's lips on mine, the way he had kissed me with a hunger I hadn't known existed. It felt wrong. So wrong. But it also felt right. And that terrified me. But it wasn't just Thomas. As if my life hadn't been complicated enough, there was Andrew Taylor. He was a colleague of mine, someone who had always been kind to me. At first, it seemed innocent enough. A little help here and there at work, a few exchanged emails, a shared project. But slowly, over time, I began to look forward to our conversations. Andrew was easy to talk to, always making me laugh, always listening when I needed to vent. It wasn't long before our interactions moved beyond the office. We started having lunch together, just the two of us, after long, exhausting days. We'd sit in quiet cafes, sipping coffee or eating sandwiches, talking about our lives, our hopes, our fears. He was supportive, constantly encouraging me to pursue my career and reminding me that I was stronger than I thought. At first, I appreciated the attention, maybe even needed it. But then, something shifted. It wasn't just friendly banter anymore. I started to feel an attraction to him, one that I hadn't expected. "Olivia," he said one afternoon, his voice soft, "you're one of the most capable people I know. I don't know how you manage everything, honestly." I felt my cheeks flush at his words. "I'm just trying to survive, Andrew." "You're doing more than surviving," he replied, smiling warmly. "You're thriving. I see it, and I admire that." I didn't know how to respond. His admiration, his kindness, it felt good. Too good. It reminded me of what I had lost with Chris. But the more I allowed myself to get close to Andrew, the more I felt myself pulled in two directions. Thomas, Andrew. Both were filling the void that Chris had left, and both were drawing me deeper into a world I wasn't sure I could control. Then came the night everything changed. It was a party. One of those work-related gatherings, full of chatter and music, people mingling and drinking, trying to forget about their responsibilities for a few hours. I found myself standing near the bar, a drink in hand, my thoughts swirling around everything that had happened over the past few months. I wasn't thinking clearly. I wasn't thinking at all. Thomas was there too. He was standing across the room, talking to some colleagues. But when his eyes met mine, everything else faded into the background. I knew what was happening. I could feel the pull between us, that magnetic force that seemed to draw us together no matter how much we tried to resist it. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. He walked over to me, his gaze locked on mine, and without a word, he took the drink from my hand, set it down, and then kissed me. It was sudden, intense, and completely reckless. There were no words, no hesitation. It was just passion. I was lost in the moment, in the heat of it, in the way he made me feel like I mattered, like I was more than just the woman who had been betrayed, more than just a vessel for revenge. For the first time in a long time, I felt alive. But the morning after, I couldn't deny the reality of what had happened. The guilt flooded in, but so did the confusion. What was I doing? What had I become? Was this all just a way to make Chris feel the pain I felt? Or had I let myself slip too far into something I couldn't control? Thomas seemed to be struggling with it too. A few days after the kiss, he pulled me aside at work, his face serious. "Liv," he said, his voice low, "we need to talk." "What's going on?" I asked, my heart pounding. "I don't think this is what you really want," he said, looking at me with those deep, searching eyes. "I can't be part of this if it's just a way to hurt Chris. I don't want to be someone you use. You're not being fair to yourself." I was taken aback. I hadn't expected this. "What are you talking about?" He sighed. "I know what you're doing. You're trying to get back at him, but it's not going to fix anything. It's just going to make things worse." I was stunned. I had never seen him so serious, so conflicted. But as he spoke, something inside me clicked. He was right. I had been using him, and I knew it, but I wasn't ready to admit it yet. The next day, Thomas went at Chris. He couldn't stay quiet any longer. He had to tell him everything, and I had no idea what the consequences would be. Would Chris be furious? Would he even care? I didn't know anymore. But the damage had been done. Everything shifted the moment Thomas told Chris. The truth, laid bare, hung in the air between us like a thick, suffocating fog. I didn't know what to expect after that, but I certainly didn't anticipate Chris's reaction. When he confronted me, his face was hard to read. A mixture of hurt and something else, something more calculating. "Liv," he said quietly, his voice tense, "I know about you and Thomas, but I'm not going to make a scene. I'm not going to throw you out. I'm not going to lash out. But I need you to understand something. This is not the way. Revenge is not going to heal what's broken between us. It's only going to make it worse." I tried to speak, to defend myself, to justify what I had done, but I couldn't find the words. Chris had always been the kind of person to hold his emotions close, to lock them behind a wall. But this time, I saw something different in him. Something resigned. Something weary. "You don't have to do this," he continued, his voice firm. "You don't have to keep running away from what happened. It's not going to fix anything. You need to face your own pain, Liv. Not this cycle of revenge." I didn't know what to say. I couldn't even look at him. How had it come to this? How had we gone from two people who had once been in love to this twisted game of deceit and retaliation? As Chris spoke, I felt my anger flare up again. How could he just stand there, telling me to forgive? Didn't he understand the betrayal I'd been living with for all these years? How could he expect me to just let go? But before I could argue further, Chris turned to Thomas. He'd been silent during our exchange, his eyes fixed on the floor. I couldn't tell if he was angry, conflicted, or just tired of the whole situation. But when Chris addressed him, I saw a flicker of something in Thomas's gaze, something that made me realize he had his own feelings in this mess. "I can't pretend I don't know what's been going on, Thomas," Chris said, "but I'm not going to fight you. I'm not going to push her into making a decision that isn't hers to make. If anything, maybe this will help her come to terms with her own choices." I could feel the weight of those words settling in. Chris wasn't going to fight me, wasn't going to demand anything from me. Instead, he wanted me to figure this out on my own. And somehow, that felt like the most painful thing of all. Chris and Thomas, for all the hurt they'd caused me, were now somehow working together, but not in the way I expected. They weren't confronting me with anger or accusations. They were trying to show me something I couldn't yet understand. A few days later, I found myself sitting across from Louise Clark, a psychologist Chris had insisted I see. It felt like an intrusion at first. I didn't want to talk to a stranger about my problems, especially when I couldn't even put my own thoughts into words. But as soon as I sat down, Louise's calm demeanor began to soothe the constant whirlwind in my head. "So, Olivia," she said gently, her voice soft but direct, "tell me what's on your mind." I hesitated, unsure where to begin. The pain felt like a knot in my stomach, and I had no idea how to untangle it. But as I began to speak, it all spilled out. The anger, the betrayal, the hurt, the loneliness I'd felt for so long, even before Chris's affair. "I don't know what I'm doing anymore," I admitted, my voice trembling. "It feels like I've been fighting for so long. But it doesn't make anything better. I thought if I hurt him the way he hurt me, it would make things right. But it's just making everything worse." Louise nodded, listening intently. "It sounds like you're looking for something that you haven't found yet. But do you think revenge is really the answer?" I bit my lip, feeling the sting of her words. "No, I don't think it is. But it feels like the only way I can get some control over what happened to me." She leaned forward slightly. "But do you think it's helping you heal? Or is it just a way to keep yourself in that place of hurt instead of moving forward?" I didn't answer immediately. Her question hung in the air, a challenge I wasn't sure I was ready to face. But slowly, I began to realize she was right. I wasn't looking for closure. I was just looking for something to distract me from the truth that I had been running from for so long. "The truth is," I said softly, "I'm not angry at Chris anymore. I'm angry at myself. I let this happen. I let him betray me, and now I'm just stuck. I don't know how to move on from that." Louise gave me a small, understanding smile. "Healing takes time, Olivia, but it's not something that happens overnight. And sometimes, the first step is admitting that you don't have to do this alone. You don't have to carry the weight of it all by yourself." It was strange to hear someone say that, to acknowledge that I wasn't supposed to handle everything on my own. I had always been so independent, so self-reliant. But maybe that was part of my problem. I had never let myself lean on anyone, not even Chris. And now, the consequences of that were clear. Meanwhile, Chris and Thomas continued to try and show me that revenge wasn't the way to solve my pain. They were both there for me, but not in the way I expected. It wasn't flirtation or attempts to win me back. They were offering me something else, emotional support, genuine care. They would check in on me, ask how I was doing, and make sure I knew I wasn't alone. Thomas, in particular, made it clear that he wasn't part of my revenge plot. He had his own reservations about what had happened between us, but he wasn't going to turn his back on me. "Liv," he said one evening, as we sat at a cafe together, "I care about you, but not like this. I don't want to be your revenge. That's not who I am." I couldn't even look at him. The guilt hit me all over again. "You're right," I whispered. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean for it to go this far." Thomas just nodded, his expression softening. "It's not too late, Liv. You don't have to keep going down this path." But despite their attempts to support me, despite the therapy and the attention, I was still consumed by the need for retribution. I couldn't let go. And that's when Chris and Thomas decided to intervene in a way I hadn't expected. They arranged a meeting, an intervention of sorts. They wanted to sit down and talk to me, to make me see the truth that the pain I was feeling couldn't be healed by revenge. They wanted me to understand that I was only hurting myself further by holding on to that bitterness. It was in the living room of our house, the one that had once been full of love and laughter. But now it felt hollow, like the shell of what it had once been. Chris, Thomas, and I sat together, the air thick with tension. It was time to face everything that had been left unsaid. "Olivia," Chris started, his voice steady, "we need to talk about what's really going on, about the hurt you're still carrying." I felt my stomach twist as I met his gaze. "I don't know what you want from me, Chris," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I don't know how to fix this." "You don't have to fix it by yourself," Thomas said gently. "But revenge? That's not the answer. It's only going to make everything worse. And we don't want to see you go down that road." It was then that the weight of everything hit me. The anger, the hurt, the confusion. It all bubbled up inside of me. And for the first time in a long time, I realized they were right. Revenge wasn't going to heal me. It was just a temporary fix, a way to avoid confronting the deeper pain I had been avoiding for years. Maybe it wasn't too late to change. Maybe, just maybe, I could let go of the bitterness and try to heal. It was a rainy afternoon when Alice showed up at my door. She was an old friend from school, someone who had always been able to see things from a different perspective. When she walked in, I was still reeling from everything that had happened. Thomas, the kiss, the emotional chaos I was wrapped in. But somehow, seeing her there brought a sense of calm I hadn't felt in weeks. Alice had always been one of those people who didn't need to say much, but when she did, her words had a way of making everything feel clearer. We decided to meet up at a cafe near my apartment. I needed to talk, and I didn't know who else to turn to. Chris had been patient with me, but the weight of everything still felt unbearable. Thomas had withdrawn, giving me space, and I wasn't sure how to rebuild from where I had left off. Alice listened as I poured out my frustrations, my desires for revenge, the years of pain I had buried beneath a facade of control. She sat there, sipping her tea, never interrupting, just listening. "I understand your anger," Alice said softly after I finished, "but you're only hurting yourself by holding on to the past. Revenge won't heal what's broken inside of you." Her words hit me like a slap in the face. I had been so focused on making Chris feel the pain I felt that I hadn't stopped to think about the toll it was taking on me. The anger, the bitterness, it was consuming me, trapping me in a cycle of hurt. Alice wasn't telling me to forgive Chris. She wasn't telling me to let go of everything right away. But she was pointing out something I hadn't seen. That my need for retribution wasn't solving anything. It was just keeping me stuck. That moment in the cafe became a turning point for me. It wasn't an immediate shift, not something I could just flip a switch on, but it planted a seed. I started to realize that maybe the path I was on wasn't the right one. And maybe, just maybe, I needed to start focusing on healing, rather than revenge. A few days later, I agreed to sit down with Chris for an honest conversation. After everything that had happened, his betrayal, my revenge, the aftermath, I hadn't known how to approach him, but the intervention had made me see things differently. Chris had asked me for honesty, and it was time I offered him the same. This time, there was no defensiveness from either of us. We both knew the truth, and we knew that it was time to stop hiding from it. Chris listened, really listened, as I spoke. There were no interruptions, no accusations, just him sitting there, absorbing everything I said. "I know what I did to you hurt you more than anything," Chris said, his voice quiet but filled with sincerity. "And I can't take that back. But what we've built since then, I want to preserve. Can you try to do the same?" His words hit me harder than anything. For so long, I had felt like I was living in the past, like I was trapped in a moment that had defined everything. But Chris's willingness to not only own his mistakes, but also to offer a chance to rebuild gave me a glimpse of something I hadn't considered in a long time. The possibility of moving forward. I realized in that moment that despite the lingering pain, Chris had been there for me. He had been patient, he had been supportive, even when I had pushed him away. He hadn't given up on me, on us. And I realized that holding on to the pain was robbing me of the chance to move forward, to heal. Revenge isn't the answer, I admitted, my voice trembling. I've been holding on to the hurt for so long that I didn't see how much it was tearing me apart. Chris nodded, a small but hopeful smile tugging at his lips. "I'm willing to try, Liv. I just need you to be open to it too." That moment, that conversation, became a pivotal point for me. I finally let go of the need to punish Chris, and instead, I focused on what was truly important, rebuilding trust and moving forward. It wasn't going to be easy, but I was ready to try. The next step in my healing journey was approaching Thomas. It wasn't easy, but I knew I had to be honest with him. I owed him an apology, not only for using him as a pawn in my revenge, but also for dragging him into something he never asked for. He had always been supportive, but I had taken advantage of his kindness. When I met him, I felt a weight on my chest. This wasn't just about apologizing to him. It was about owning the fact that I had been using him to fill a void. And it wasn't fair to him. "Thomas," I began, my voice shaky, "I've been using you. I've been using you to cope with everything I've been feeling. And I know it wasn't right." He looked at me, his expression soft but serious. "Olivia, I never wanted to be part of your revenge plan. I care about you, but I just wanted to be a friend. I didn't want to hurt you." His words brought tears to my eyes. I had hurt him, and I had hurt myself in the process. I had used him as a way to mask my pain, and it wasn't fair to him. I felt guilty for dragging him into something he didn't deserve. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice cracking. "I'm sorry for everything. I used you, and I shouldn't have." Thomas didn't say much after that, but his reassurance meant everything. "It's okay, Liv. I'm just glad you're starting to see things differently. You need to find peace within yourself, not with anyone else." Those words stuck with me. I had been looking for peace outside of myself for so long, trying to find it in revenge, in validation from others. But what I needed most was peace within me. I wasn't going to find it by holding on to the past or trying to control others. As I continued my journey of healing, Chris and I decided to start therapy together. I had been going on my own for a while, but we both knew that if we wanted to truly rebuild, we needed to address the issues in our relationship. Therapy was difficult. There were old wounds that we had never fully addressed, things that had festered over the years and been swept under the rug. But with each session, I felt a little more open, a little more willing to face the truth. In therapy, we began to explore the dynamics of our relationship, the things that had caused the distance between us. It wasn't just Chris's betrayal that had led to this point. It was years of emotional neglect, of not communicating, of taking each other for granted. But through therapy, we began to uncover the root causes of our issues, and we started to work on them together. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when I wanted to give up. But with Chris by my side, I felt like we were making progress. I also realized that forgiveness wasn't something that happened once and was done. It was a process, a continuous journey. I had to be vulnerable with Chris, to let go of my pride and my anger. And it was painful. But with each step, I felt a little lighter, a little freer. I began to understand that forgiveness wasn't just for Chris, It was for me. It was about letting go of the past, not for his sake, but for mine. After weeks of therapy and self-reflection, I reached a moment of clarity. I no longer needed to seek validation from others. I didn't need to prove anything to anyone, especially not to Chris. What I needed most was peace with myself. I had spent so much time looking for validation and trying to reclaim lost power, but I realized that wasn't what mattered. I stopped seeking external approval. I started finding my own strength, my own voice. I no longer defined my worth by Chris's betrayal or by my need for revenge. I defined it by my ability to grow, to forgive, and to heal. And that newfound clarity empowered me to look at my marriage with fresh eyes. No longer burdened by the past, I could see the possibility of a future that didn't revolve around pain and resentment. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe. And maybe, just maybe, there was hope for us after all. The day had finally come for a heartfelt conversation between Chris and me. We sat together in the living room, the children in their rooms, and everything between us felt like it had been years in the making. "I know I hurt you," Chris said, his voice shaky, "and I'm sorry, but I've done everything I can to make this right. You've been so strong, and I know it's not easy to forgive me." Tears welled up in my eyes as I looked at him. "I couldn't forgive you until I forgave myself. I needed to find peace, Chris, and I finally have." His words sank in. In that moment, the walls between us started to fade. It wasn't perfect, but we had worked hard to reach this point, and we were ready to rebuild. Trust wasn't going to be restored overnight, but I saw Chris's efforts to change, and slowly, I started trusting him again. We talked openly about our fears and hopes for the future, attending therapy together, and each session brought us closer to healing. The walls we had built over the years were crumbling. As Chris and I worked on our relationship, we also made an effort to reconnect with our children. We involved them in family activities, creating new memories that replaced the painful ones. They noticed the positive changes in us, and it felt like we were giving them a sense of security again. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. On our wedding anniversary, Chris surprised me with a small wooden box containing a note that read, "I will always choose you." I was touched by his sincerity, and in return, I gave him a ring, a symbol of my commitment to myself and our family. It was a promise that forgiveness, though difficult, was a continuous process, and we were committed to moving forward together. Walking through the park that evening, hand in hand, I reflected on everything we had been through. It hadn't been easy, but we had both learned valuable lessons about trust, vulnerability, and the importance of love. We weren't the same people as before, but we were stronger for it. We talked about the future, no longer with fear, but with hope. We knew challenges would arise, but we were ready to face them together. The past had shaped us, but it no longer defined us. We had a second chance at happiness, and we were determined to make the most of it. True healing, I realized, doesn't come from revenge or resentment. It comes from forgiveness, of others and of yourself. That was the greatest gift we could give each other.